welcome to another week of this travel, anthropology, international studies, the world course. Today we're going to talk about kinds of borders. We're going to mention briefly globalization, and we're going to talk about also the concept of citizenship. But before we get started, for the reading today, for the reading for this week, it started with a reference to the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And the main protagonist, Arthur Dent, he's given this guidebook and sort of it's very confusing. There's a lot to cover, but there's also the directive, don't panic. And I like that. I like starting this way because as you consider traveling, as you consider going around the world or going to a number of countries, I also want you to not panic. You shouldn't panic. In many ways, navigating the world is a lot easier now. We have, of course, so many different applications. There's all kinds of stuff on the internet. You can see pictures of the hotel. You can know exactly where you're going to be. You can also join these predetermined, these very determined, highly determined circuits. You can buy these packages as week long. You know, they're going to take you to all the important sites. You're going to get all the important pictures, and then you come back and it's very safe and you have traveled. But at the same time, it can be difficult to truly immerse yourself in the culture, to really feel like you're meeting people, to really feel like you are engaging with the culture, and that's what can be difficult. The famous guidebook that I happen to enjoy, it's called Lonely Planet, and there's always a section that's called Off the Beaten Path. It's good and it's also bad. You think about this, you know, these international best-selling guidebooks, and they have a section called Off the Beaten Path. We can imagine that even off the beaten path is going to get pretty crowded. And again, I always recommend meeting people. That's how you're really going to engage with the culture. So for us, international studies is it's a good home for us because we're talking about so many different things, traveling the world, politics, etc. International studies, it draws from all these different disciplines, all these different academic disciplines, from anthropology to politics to economics to history, geography, etc. So that's where we are. We're in international studies. Politics, it helps us understand how countries get along, how they interact with each other. But often they don't do a very good job of talking about how individuals interact with each other. One of the things that happens when you travel, one of the beautiful things that happens when you travel is that you stop talking about countries as though they're entities. You know, China today did this, you know, South Korea believes that. And one of my absolute phrases that I detest a number of years ago, it was popular to say, Iraq hates us because of our freedom. So Iraq hates the United States because the United States is free. Iraq doesn't hate anybody. Iraq, they're incapable of hating. It's a country. There are people inside the country, and those people can have those emotions, but the country itself. So as you travel, as you enter into different countries, you're going to meet people. And then when you hear somebody say, well, in Iraq does this, you're immediately going to think about the people that you met in that coffee shop on your way to whatever site, the guide that helped you get to a certain point, and you're gonna be able to provide a little bit more nuance to that phrase. But in traveling, you're gonna cross borders. That's what we're gonna do. We're gonna cross borders. And I have to mention, of course, Gloria Anzaldúa. She wrote a book called Borderlands, La Frontera. I'm gonna read you the quote that she uses to start the book, and she says this. She's talking about the U.S.-Mexico border, and this is what she says. The U.S.-Mexican border es una herida abierta, where the third world grates against the first and bleeds. And before a scab forms, it hemorrhages. Again, the lifeblood of two worlds merging to form a third country, a border culture. So borders, they do divide different countries and cultures, but the area around the border can become sort of this a third culture, a third world, as it were. There are 5 borders, and I'm going to add a 6th one, but there are 5 borders that we're going to talk about: geographic, political, economic, social, and of course, cultural. Cultural borders, that's what anthropology, that's what they study. But I'm going to add a 6th border, and I'm not sure what to call this border. I don't have one-word term for it, but it's the border that we cross that has to do with our stereotypes, what we think about traveling itself, what we think about this other country, the people who live in this other country. There's these ideas that we have, these preconceived ideas that we have about this other country or about the how we're going to travel, and that's the border that we're going to cross. So what happens when you cross a border? What is the purpose of a border? Is it to keep other people out? Is it for protection? Or does it also function to keep us inside? I like to pose the question often in my class, which is, what do you think would happen if we just got rid of all of the borders around the world? Just got rid of them. No more borders anywhere. If we just opened up all of the borders, what would happen? Typically, the response I get is, well, we can't do that because people would flock to the United States. People would flood. They would come in and they would overwhelm our systems. Maybe it's a hypothetical question. It's impossible to really know what would actually happen. But I do think that far fewer people than we think would flood into this country. There was a program, it was called the Braterros Program, 1942 to 1964, and it was a program by which migrant farm workers, they came from Mexico into the United States and they worked. And it was kind of an open border, so they would come, they would work, and they would go back, right? And so you kind of had this sort of circular migration. You come work and then you go back home. It ended in 1964, and several years later, that border, actually in that time, the border was closed. And that's where you had people coming into the United States and they could no longer return. So that's where you had Mexican farm workers starting to stay in the United States. There's a book by Robert Barsky. It's called Undocumented Immigrants in an Era of Arbitrary Law, The Flight and Plight of People Deemed Illegal. It's published in 2015. And in it, he also posits this idea that we need to just open borders. And also keep in mind, we'll talk about this in a little bit, but keep in mind too that sometimes the border is what crosses people. It's not always that we cross the border. I mentioned the US-Mexico border. In 1848, the border almost overnight went from a certain point down to the Rio Grande, right? And so people who were living in Mexico all of a sudden found themselves living in the United States. Right now, there are approximately 200 independent states, whereas about 100 years ago, there were only 50. So we're getting more and more nation states, right? And governments, of course, they're going to decide who can belong, who is a citizen, and who can't be a citizen, and what the test looks like, right? What are the things you need to know in order to become a citizen? In some cases, as in the United States, at least for now, if you're born in this country, you are automatically a citizen. It's not always the case in other countries. Countries in the UN are referred to as nation states. I mentioned this term earlier because generally speaking, the political and the cultural borders, they coincide. Not always, but generally they coincide. In the case of Africa, though, there are 54 countries, but approximately 300 distinct nations, okay? So what happened is you start dividing these nations, and it's not necessarily, you're splitting very old nations. It's not natural, as it were. And again, this is what's covered in the field of anthropology. The United States itself has borders, right? Different states. Think about what happens. Some of you have traveled to different states, and when you become a resident of a different state, all of a sudden your driver's license is no longer valid. You have approximately 2 to 3 months. You have to change your driver's license. I have had to do it numerous times because the laws are different. You have to know different things. In Oregon, for instance, you have to have a front license plate and a back license plate on your car, right? That's not the case in Georgia. One of the first things I was told when I arrived in Oregon, make sure you get a license plate in the front of your car. So we talk about crossing borders. We talked about different aspects to belonging, citizenship. How do you establish your personal identity? What are the things that make up who you are? In my experience in the United States, there are 2 questions that are super important, that are fundamental. Whenever I meet somebody in the United States, there are 2 things they want to know. One, they want to know where I'm from, and they want to know what I do. Where are you from? Cool. What is it that you do for a living? What's your job? Cool. I got you kind of figured out, and now we can move on. That question, where are you from, is a little problematic for me because grew up in Spain, half Cuban, lived in the United States and a whole bunch of different countries. So that question always, it's complicated for me. I don't have an easy answer for you. So it's often difficult for people to put me in that box or figure out who I am. But those are the two things that are important. But you have essentially country, state, language, race, ethnic group, gender, or some sort of combination of that. That's your identity. That's who you are, right? Or if you're in the United States, maybe your job defines you, right? So these are things to consider as you enter other domains, as you go to other countries. Again, in my experience, when I'm traveling around Europe, it's not very often that they ask me where I'm from, or it's not very often that they ask me what I do. In some cases, they don't really care what you do. Right? There are other things that are more important, maybe your hobbies, or maybe, I don't know, your favorite soccer team, for instance. I don't know. So now we have to turn to globalization. I have to mention globalization, of course. I warned you it was coming, but we're just going to touch on it briefly and then move on. I'm also tired of hearing this term, but it's a very important one. It was first coined in 1983. That's how old this term is. And it refers to trade and financial relationships, of course, these integrated communities, the communication that occurs. The world has gotten a lot smaller, right? There's a new term now, though, because globalization, there's a lot of baggage. It maybe doesn't define or describe what is actually happening. So the new term now is hyperglobalization. Well, what does that mean? I'm glad you asked. Nation states, it is perceived, or it is thought, are in steady decline. We have to see if that's actually the case or not, but this is what's perceived. Nation states are in steady decline. There's a growing number of issues that are global in nature, right? And there's also greater mobility of capital, new patterns of finance and commerce, etc. And there's an increased number of transnational interactions, right? But overall, or the most important part of this is that there are issues that are global in nature that kind of expand beyond the nation state, right? And so how do we deal with these problems? How do we overcome them? There is a counterweight, of course, to this hyperglobalization. You've seen this with the rise of nationalism in different countries around the world, right? So how do you respond? How do you react? How do you feel when somebody brings up the term globalization? Are you exhausted by the term, as I am? Are you pro-globalization? You're happy because now we have access to so many goods at a much cheaper price, and the tide went up, and as it were, all the boats also rose with the tide. Or are you a little bit concerned with the problems that came with globalization? How is it possible that we can have all of these goods and not pay very much money for them? The phones that we have, the computers, does that bother you to a certain extent? We all know these factories that exist around the world. We kind of, we deal with it in different ways. Maybe we ignore it, or maybe there's some activism that we participate in. Foxconn, of course, is the famous one. They build iPads and iPhones and PlayStation 4, I believe, and a few other things. There was I'll mention briefly, a worker. His name was Shu Li, and he committed suicide in 2014. I want to read you a poem real quick. He wrote a number of poems that were published in a magazine put out by Foxconn itself. And this is the poem. It's called "A Screw Fell to the Ground." And this is, of course, translated. A screw fell to the ground in this dark night of overtime, plunging vertically, lightly clinking. It won't attract anyone's attention, just like last time, on a night like this, when someone plunged to the ground. I bring this up only because when we talk abstractly, when we talk sort of, levels of poverty, levels of existence that have risen, okay, these factories, they might not be up to our standards, but they're better off than they were before. That might be the case, and maybe that's how you get around this. But better than before doesn't necessarily mean good. And I think there's more that we can do. I'm going to mention briefly, of course, Greta Thunberg. I have to mention her. She drew a lot of controversy as well because she is very vocal about certain inequalities, climate change, etc. around the world. But she drew a lot of controversy some years ago because she traveled in a boat across the ocean. polluting and so forth. And how can you, how can you be so against all of these things and still participate or still use, these modes of transportation? I say this because I also use a phone. I also use these devices. Part of what we need to get to when we talk about these global issues is that we are interconnected, right? We are living in a world, right, as it were. And just because we use some of this technology, some of these devices, doesn't mean that we need to be okay with it, or that we need to accept their existence, right? We can still try to affect change, and I think we should continue to affect change. I have this conversation often, and the response is always the same. Well, you use a phone. Well, you use, yes, exactly. The point, though, is that if I were to get rid of all of my devices, if I were to truly live according to what I would hope, right, for the whole world, you would think I was a lunatic. You wouldn't pay any attention to me. Possibly, maybe not. I don't know. I think often about in the United States, when you criticize something about the United States, the first response is typically, or in my experience, the first response has always been, well, if you don't like it here, why don't you leave? Okay, that's one way to go about doing things. It's one way to solve the problem, I suppose. It also comes from a place of privilege. Maybe I'm not able to move, or maybe I don't have the resources to move to a different country. Maybe other countries wouldn't accept me, right? So it's a problematic phrase. But I was struck because a number of years ago, there was a friend of mine who was living in Spain. He was criticizing things that were happening in the United States. And the responses overwhelmingly were, you don't live in this country. You have no right to say, you have no right to criticize what happens in this country. So really, it's a lose-lose situation. You can't criticize anything in this country, because if you do, then you should leave. And if you leave and then you criticize, you can't criticize because you don't live in this country. And I think we can move beyond those or that dichotomy. I want to mention too an episode I saw of Shark Tank. I don't know if you're a fan of the show. For a while, I was very much into it. I love to see these people creating and innovators, right? Entrepreneurs, etc. And there's this one gentleman from a mining town in Appalachia, and he had this. There were a couple of things that he was doing. One, he was manufacturing, I think they were jeans or clothes that were durable. But the other thing that he noted too was that in his town there were no jobs. The jobs were kind of disappearing, and so all of his friends and his family, they were jobless. And so what he was doing was he was creating a good product, and he was providing jobs for the community. And so he's pitching this idea to these 4 or 5, entrepreneurs and millionaires, billionaires, standard stories of success, right? These are the people that we look up to. I want to be like them. They're so successful, right? So they ask him, are you willing to move to a different country? Are you willing to move to Vietnam or to China? We need to be able to scale this out. That's how you're going to make a lot of money. And his response was, I can't do that. I can't do that because part of my vision, part of what I set out to do was to provide jobs. So if I take this away, then I'm no good. I'm no better than other companies that have taken jobs away. And so they all decline, and for this reason, I'm out. For this reason, I'm out, etc. Right? And it was really sad. It struck me as sad that the margins, the profit margins weren't enough for them to buy into this project. So anyway, all that to say that when you talk about globalization, you talk about the interconnectedness of the world. There's always a price to pay. And there's a conversation that we can have, there's a debate that we can have, and hopefully move toward a more equitable society. So with all of these accounts, the focus on competitiveness and efficiency, it's possible that globalization is not paying attention or is not taking care of basic needs, or not taking into consideration the impact on the human condition. It's possible. Again, maybe we're better off, but maybe better off is not equivalent to good, and we can get there. But what's important with all of this is the idea that we need to be aware of these global issues. Wendell Berry has a great quote that I love, and this is the quote: "Do unto those downstream as you would have those upstream do unto you." I love that because it's not just what I do in my own backyard or in my own nation state, in my own country. Often rivers, they cross countries. And so the pollution that if we pollute rivers, it's going to affect people downstream. And we need to act in such a way as, the people who are upstream from us, how do we want them to act? Because that water, of course, we're going to use that water. We need to think of ourselves as global citizens. There's a great indigenous directive, an indigenous way of thinking that has you thanking the previous 7 generations and then thinking about the 7 future generations. And it's just a great place to be. You're constantly aware of where you are, thanking the people that came before you, and then also thinking about, conscious of the future, the 7 generations coming after you. And we can extrapolate that on a global scale as well. Oxfam has a number of sort of descriptions for what it means to be a global citizen. Number 1, be aware of the wider world. That's what we're trying to do with this, trying to give you a glimpse into different parts of the world. Respect and value diversity. That's number 2. Number 3, have an understanding of how the world works. That's also what we're trying to do with this course. Number 4, be outraged by social injustice. Number 5, participate in the community at various levels, from local to global. Number 6, be willing to act to make the world a more equitable and sustainable place. And finally, number 7, take responsibility for your actions. These might not be very practical, they might be a bit abstract, but I think it gets us into a way of thinking, a type of thinking that is going to help us to appreciate diversity, help us to appreciate the rest of the world. Everything local, of course, is global. And you've heard this before, but I'll say it again and we'll end with this. Think globally, but act locally.